I never imagined that something as small and ordinary as a plastic tube would change the way I saw my entire life. But the day I held that DNA testing kit in my trembling hands, I felt a weight sitting quietly in my chest, like a secret I hadn't even known I was carrying. Because all I thought I was doing was answering a simple curiosity about my roots, something lighthearted, something harmless, something people joked about at dinner parties. Yet, the moment I mailed that sample away, the waiting began to fill my days with a strange unease I couldn't name. And I kept telling myself it was silly, that I already knew who I was, where I came from, and that nothing a lab reported back could change the truth I had lived my whole life. I grew up believing my story was simple. A mother who worked endlessly to give me everything she could, a quiet father who rarely spoke but always stood nearby, and a modest childhood built from love, routine, and comforting predictability, where birthdays were celebrated with homemade cake and laughter, and family photos lined the hallway walls like proof of belonging. I never questioned where I fit, never questioned why my dark eyes didn't quite match my sister's bright ones, or why relatives would sometimes pause before saying we looked alike, brushing it away with a nervous laugh, or why older family members glanced at me differently when certain stories from the past were told, because every family has strange little moments, and I believed that was all it was. So when a friend casually mentioned doing a DNA test just for fun, discovering a mix of interesting ancestries and distant cousins, I laughed and thought it sounded like a harmless distraction, something cheerful to do on a slow weekend. And I ordered one without a deeper thought, thinking it would confirm what I already knew and maybe give me some amusing facts to share. The kit arrived in a plain little box on an ordinary afternoon, and I remember sitting at my kitchen table alone, staring at it longer than necessary, feeling oddly hesitant, as if some quiet voice inside me wanted to warn me even though I had no reason to listen, because curiosity felt stronger than caution at that moment. I followed the instructions precisely, sealed the sample, and dropped it into the mailbox at the end of my street, hearing it land with a small echo, completely unaware that the sound would linger in my memory far longer than it should have, because after that, waiting became both exciting and uneasy, a strange emotional mixture I didn't know how to explain to anyone. Days turned into weeks, and life continued as usual on the surface. But beneath my daily routines, I found myself thinking about that little test more than I expected, wondering what strange combinations it might find, what surprises it might reveal, yet always assuming it would confirm the story I had lived my entire life. Then the email arrived late one night, the subject line simply saying my results were ready, and I did not open it right away. I sat on my bed, holding my phone, heart beating faster than made sense, asking myself why I felt nervous about something that should have meant nothing more than fun information. And yet my fingers trembled as I tapped the screen, and when the page loaded, my breath caught in my chest. Because as I scanned the text, reading percentages and unfamiliar regional groups, something felt off, like reading a reflection that didn't resemble the face I knew. I scrolled down slowly until I reached the section listing family connections, fully expecting nothing more than distant relatives or long-lost cousins I would never contact, but instead I froze when I saw a bold label that said, "Close Family Match," followed by a name I did not recognize, linked as a potential biological sibling. My first thought was that this must be a mistake. Technology isn't perfect, and surely something had gone wrong with the database, because I knew my sister, I had only one sister, and no one had ever mentioned another sibling in my entire life, not once, not in whispers or jokes or half-hidden secrets, and yet there it was, printed in cold digital certainty, refusing to disappear when I blinked or refreshed the screen. I remember laughing quietly to myself, a nervous sound, telling myself it was nothing, a glitch, a misunderstanding, something that would all make sense once I looked closer. But my hands were shaking as I tapped through the profile, reading more details, seeing overlapping DNA percentages that made denial harder with every second, until the truth began creeping toward me like an uninvited guest I no longer felt able to ignore. I stared at the ceiling for a long time that night, phone still glowing in my hand, feeling a tightening in my chest that felt different from normal fear, heavier, deeper, as if something fundamental inside me had shifted without permission, and I kept whispering questions into the air that had no immediate answers. Who was this person? How could this be real? What did it mean for the family I thought I knew? Sleep did not come easily, and when I did drift off, my dreams were restless, filled with memories of childhood, faces from old photos that now seemed slightly unfamiliar, as if every image might suddenly hide a secret I'd never noticed. Over the following days, I tried to push the results aside, telling myself not to overreact, to wait until I could speak with customer support or counselors provided by the service. But the quiet dread wouldn't leave because deep down I sensed that some truths, once revealed, are not undone with explanations or second opinions. I began replaying moments from my upbringing that once felt harmless. Comments about my appearance, stories I overheard as a child but never questioned, the way my parents avoided certain conversations about the past. And suddenly, these memories formed an unsettling pattern I had never seen before. I found myself watching my mother more closely during our weekly calls, studying the way she spoke, the pauses in her sentences whenever family history came up, and hearing a softness in her voice that I now wondered might have been protective silence rather than simple forgetfulness. And it stirred a quiet ache inside me that felt both loving and fearful. I didn't tell anyone about the results yet because I had no idea how to frame it without sounding judgmental or dramatic, but my mind wouldn't stop racing through possibilities, each one heavier than the last, and I felt like I was standing at the edge of an emotional cliff, peering into an unknown depth I hadn't prepared for. Though no dramatic confrontation had occurred yet, I could feel a storm forming beneath the calm of everyday life because that single screen of data had cracked open the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my origins. And I sensed with growing certainty that the truth waiting ahead would not be lighthearted or amusing at all, but something far more complicated, something that would force me to question identity, family, and belonging in ways I never imagined when I first ordered that innocent little kit online.
As the days stretched forward after seeing that unexpected DNA result, the quiet tension inside me deepened, settling into every moment like a low hum I could not switch off, because even while cooking dinner, answering emails, or folding laundry, my mind kept wandering back to the name on that screen, the stranger who shared my blood but not my memories, and I felt torn between wanting to know everything immediately and wishing the discovery had never happened at all. It felt safer, somehow, to remain in uncertainty than to step toward whatever truth might wait beyond it. Late one evening, when the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, I finally opened the DNA app again, lingering over the profile I had avoided for days, reading the short bio the person had written, their interests and general location, details that made them feel suddenly real rather than abstract. And with every line I read, something in me tightened with both curiosity and quiet fear. I imagined their life unfolding parallel to mine without either of us knowing the other existed, two paths born from the same roots but shaped by completely different worlds, and the realization that a piece of my story might be living an entirely separate life unsettled me deeply. I began composing a message to them several times, writing a few polite words of introduction, then deleting the entire thing before pressing send, because the thought of opening a conversation felt monumental, like stepping into a room where everything would change the moment I spoke, and I wasn't yet brave enough to face that transformation. My thoughts quickly turned toward my parents, especially my mother, whose voice had always been my anchor of warmth and reassurance, and I wondered what knowledge she held that I did not, what choices and sacrifices laid hidden under years of quiet caregiving, and whether she had carried a secret all this time to protect someone, perhaps me, from pain she thought was unnecessary or too heavy. I felt a tender conflict rise inside me, because I loved her deeply and feared that uncovering this truth might hurt her or reopen old wounds she had spent decades burying beneath the responsibilities of family life. Yet, alongside that love was a growing need to understand my own identity fully, to know the whole story of where I came from rather than the version I had always been given. I replayed childhood scenes in my mind with new eyes, noticing moments where my parents were extra cautious about conversations in front of me, or where extended family members gently redirected talk away from certain years in our past. And suddenly, those moments no longer seemed like coincidence, but deliberate pauses hiding something unspoken. I remembered overhearing relatives once say, when they thought I wasn't listening, "It was for the best," without context or explanation, words that had meant nothing to me as a child, but which now echoed with haunting clarity, stirring questions I wished had never taken root. The night air outside my window felt heavy as I stared into the darkness, contemplating whether asking my mother directly would bring answers or cause irreversible emotional fractures, because I did not want to hurt the person who had loved me my entire life, yet I also could not ignore the tremor running through my chest every time I thought about this unknown sibling. With hesitation, I wrote their name down on a piece of paper, tracing the letters slowly with my finger as if they might deliver some understanding simply through touch. And I wondered whether they were feeling the same wave of shock and confusion somewhere else in the world, holding their phone and questioning the story they too had believed. That shared emotional possibility, the idea that another person might be experiencing this revelation alongside me, stirred both a strange comfort and sadness, because no matter how close our DNA connection was, years of separation meant we were strangers standing at opposite ends of an invisible bridge. I finally pressed the message send button near midnight, typing only a brief greeting and acknowledgement of similarity without assumptions, feeling my heart pound wildly as the app confirmed the message had been delivered. And I sat back on my bed with trembling hands, fully aware I had just crossed a boundary that could not be recrossed, because whatever reply came back would open a door I would never be able to close again. Waiting for a response became its own small torment. Each passing hour stretched long as I checked my phone more often than I cared to admit, wondering if this person would ignore the message, hesitate like I had, or respond with immediate curiosity. And during those silent hours, my thoughts grew louder, circling around identity, family truth, and the fragile stories we tell ourselves to feel anchored in this world. I began to feel an emotional distance from the familiar comforts around me, not because they had changed, but because I had, because those old assurances I relied on now felt incomplete, as if someone had removed a quiet but vital piece of the puzzle that gave my self-understanding its shape. At last a reply appeared, gentle, cautious, and unmistakably real, saying they had similar questions and were just as startled by the discovery. And in reading their words, a surprising sense of kinship washed over me, proving that uncertainty itself can sometimes be a shared ground of belonging. We exchanged a few short messages that night, careful not to dive too deeply too quickly, simply acknowledging our confusion and the imaginable strangeness of finding each other through a database rather than through the natural bonds of family life. And while the conversation brought emotional warmth, it also confirmed that a greater reckoning lay ahead, because now I had living proof that there was more to my story than I had ever known. After putting my phone down, I sat quietly in the moonlight, feeling a mixture of awe, grief, curiosity, and dread fold together in my chest, understanding that what began as an innocent test just for fun had quietly unraveled the neat boundaries of my personal history, exposing a hidden chapter that I had no choice but to confront eventually. I had not yet spoken to my mother or any family member, and the silence around that unspoken truth began to feel heavier with each passing day, like a secret shared between me and strangers, but absent from the people who mattered most. And deep down I sensed that the hardest emotional journey ahead would not be contacting this newfound sibling, but facing the loving family whose silence had shaped my entire understanding of who I was. As I slipped into bed that night, exhaustion settling in but sleep nowhere near, I realized the true conflict had officially begun. Not the curiosity about ancestry or the novelty of technology, but the emotional reckoning of reconciling the comforting story I had lived by with the complicated truth now pressing against the surface of my life. And I knew, with a certainty that both frightened and strengthened me, that discovering the full story of my origins would demand emotional courage I wasn't sure I yet possessed.
Before that DNA kit ever arrived in my mailbox, my life had felt steady and predictable in the quiet way that most ordinary lives do, built around small routines and long-standing relationships that seemed permanent simply because they had always been there. And when I look back now, I realize how deeply rooted I was in the belief that I fully understood where I came from. I was raised in a modest home filled with familiar warmth rather than grand excitement, where my mother's gentle singing while she cooked became the background music of my childhood, and my father's calm, thoughtful advice shaped how I saw the world. And though we were never wealthy or flashy, I always felt rich in the simple security of belonging. My parents spoke often about family values, honesty, and compassion, emphasizing that our shared history connected us in a way nothing else could. And as a child, I absorbed those words unquestioningly, never imagining there might be unspoken additions to that history left outside the story they told me. Most of our weekends were spent gathered with relatives, passing large dishes around cluttered tables, listening to stories about the old days as elders laughed softly at memories only they fully understood. And I paid little attention to the moments when conversations shifted or voices lowered suddenly, assuming, as children do, that the adults were simply talking about matters too complicated to involve me. I grew up believing I looked like my father, echoed my mother's kindness, and carried traits inherited cleanly through obvious family lines. And whenever neighbors commented on what a caring, harmonious family we seemed to be, I glowed with pride, unaware that harmony can sometimes be carefully maintained through silence as much as through openness. As I entered adulthood, married, built a career, and later began telling emotional stories online through my channel Granny Tales, my comfort with storytelling deepened my appreciation for personal narratives and how they shape the people we become. Yet, ironically, I never questioned my own story at its roots, assuming there was nothing left to uncover beyond what I had been taught. My parents supported my creative work quietly and faithfully, calling to tell me how a certain story had moved them or how proud they were that I brought comfort to others, and their encouragement only reinforced my belief that our bond was built on openness and trust without hidden corners or locked doors. When the idea of taking a DNA ancestry test first came up, it had nothing to do with doubt or suspicion, but everything to do with curiosity and entertainment. A popular trend that friends shared as if it were a fun personality quiz, and I imagined it might provide interesting trivia about my heritage or help me connect distant dots across continents I'd never visited. I ordered the kit casually,
dropping the saliva sample into the prepaid envelope as if mailing any ordinary letter, not recognizing that this small, simple act would quietly challenge the very foundation of how I define myself as a daughter, as a woman, and as a storyteller whose truth had always felt complete. While waiting for results, I pictured exciting but harmless discoveries, percentages of ancestry from countries I'd only read about, or gentle confirmations of the roots I believed already secure, and I even joked with my mother about imagining she was secretly royalty or descended from travelers of some distant land, recalling how she laughed softly and waved my curiosity away with a playful, "Whatever you find, you're still my child." Words that now returned to me weighted with deeper meaning. When the email arrived announcing my results were ready, I expected a quick look and a smile before returning to my day. But the moment I opened that page and saw unexpected numbers that did not align with everything I'd been taught, accompanied by the name of a close relative unknown to me, the air seemed to thin around me as if the room itself had shifted. At first, I dismissed the data as technical error or distant misinterpretation, gently telling myself technology couldn't possibly rewrite decades of lived experience. But a tightening behind my eyes and a pounding pulse suggested otherwise, pushing me to stare longer and read more carefully rather than closing the window in denial. I felt suspended between disbelief and an unnamed sense of anticipation because even confusion can awaken curiosity, and part of me wanted desperately to understand how this stranger connected to me when no place for them existed in the family tree I'd grown up memorizing. My hands trembled slightly as I refreshed the page, clicked into explanation tabs, and studied the site's definitions of genetic proximity, realizing that the label attached to this person implied something far more intimate than a distant cousin or forgotten branch of the family. And that realization stirred both an ache and a fascination deep in me. Memories of family conversations resurfaced like puzzle pieces refusing to stay buried, moments where elders exchanged quiet glances, or when certain years or relatives were never mentioned without explanation, and I began to see faint cracks forming along the smooth surface of my long-held understanding. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became, because trust once assumed unbreakable suddenly felt more fragile, and not because I believed my parents had acted with malice, but because I wondered what protective intentions might have driven a choice to preserve silence instead of full honesty. I replayed memories of my mother's gentle manner and emotionally safe presence, refusing to believe she could be capable of deception rooted in selfishness, yet simultaneously acknowledging that love can motivate secrecy when parents believe hiding truth protects their children from pain. I felt unexpectedly small, confronting questions without answers, as though my adult confidence had shrunk beneath the weight of childhood vulnerability returning uninvited, and I quietly mourned the certainty I had enjoyed for so many years because certainty, even when imperfect, can be emotionally comforting in a way that uncertainty never is. At the same time, the storyteller in me felt drawn forward, compelled by the belief that truth, no matter how disruptive, has a rightful place in personal growth and emotional healing, and that resisting it might ultimately cause more sorrow than meeting it with open eyes and a tender heart. Sitting alone that evening with the warm lamplight pooling around me, I thought of the audience who listened to my narrated stories, seeking comfort in tales of resilience and love, unaware that I was now standing at the threshold of my own deeply personal story, uncertain which emotional path it would take. I whispered a quiet promise to myself that night, to remain gentle with everyone involved, especially my parents, because whatever truth emerged had unfolded long before I existed, shaped by circumstances I might never fully understand. And even as questions multiplied in my mind, I have not yet lost sight of the unshakable fact that love had always been present in my upbringing, regardless of any missing pieces in our shared narrative. Still, as I prepared for bed, the simple realization lingered that my childhood story, once so fixed and safe, had now opened into something more fluid and uncertain, hinting that the emotional journey ahead would demand not only curiosity, but compassion far deeper than I had ever needed before, because understanding where we come from sometimes means learning how to hold complicated truths while continuing to love the people who raised us.
In the days that followed, the DNA results lingered quietly in the background of my thoughts like a half-finished song that refuses to leave the mind, playing during everyday moments as I tried to return to routine without truly leaving the unanswered questions behind. Because no matter how much I folded laundry, answered emails from viewers of granny tales, or cooked simple meals for myself and my husband, that single unfamiliar name continued floating through my mind, distant yet strangely intimate, reminding me that something vital remained unresolved beneath the surface of my daily calm. I resisted the urge to confront my parents immediately, knowing my emotions required settling before any meaningful conversation could take place, because sudden confrontation fueled by confusion might risk accidental pain rather than understanding. And so I chose instead to quietly explore the information available to me directly through the genealogy platform, scrolling through shared matches, reading predicted relationships, and studying diagrams outlining degrees of kinship that suddenly felt uncomfortably personal rather than abstract illustrations. With each new click, I felt an odd mixture of caution and courage stir within me, since curiosity now shared space with loyalty, and I wondered how one could search for truth while protecting the hearts of those who had lovingly protected mine, not realizing that both pursuits might collide before clarity emerged. At night, when sleep came in shallow stretches, I dreamed of standing in unfamiliar family homes where faces seemed recognizable yet unnamed, and waking from these dreams left me unsettled, as if my subconscious had already begun weaving new possibilities from information my waking mind still hesitated to accept fully. I found myself studying old photographs during the quiet afternoons, running my fingers gently over glossy surfaces showing my parents when they were young, looking for visual clues like slightly mismatched features or expressions of guarded emotion, though I knew such a search was unlikely to uncover concrete answers, but it comforted me to feel physically connected to tangible reminders of family, while intangible doubts swirled invisibly around me. I recalled moments from my childhood when relatives spoke of journeys, difficult decisions, or periods of separation, stories that had never included specifics, but now struck me as possibly more than coincidence. And while none of these memories offered certainty, together they formed a delicate pattern of hints that a fuller truth may have been concealed beneath simplified storytelling intended to safeguard younger hearts from adult complexities. My mother called regularly during this time, with gentle check-ins, her voice warm and casual as she asked about work and health, never hinting that she sensed my internal struggle, and though I longed to say everything at once, I carried our familiar conversational rhythm forward normally, unwilling to let hidden questions disrupt the emotional comfort she clearly treasured in our bond. My father's brief but steady calls carried their usual tone of practical support, asking if my car was running well or whether I had eaten properly. And while listening to him, I felt an expanding ache rooted not in suspicion but in anticipation, because I feared that seeking answers might cause hurt I never intended to create, questioning whether truth should always be uncovered if it might fracture relationships built on decades of trust. At the same time, staying silent with knowledge felt isolating, as if I were carrying a private emotional burden no one else could see, and some evenings I sat quietly and that tears slipped down without knowing exactly what I mourned: lost certainty, anticipated conflict, or simply the vulnerability of realizing parents are more complex than our childhood ideals once allowed us to see. I confided in my husband one evening, allowing the first words to escape beyond my own thoughts, and his calm response steadied me as he reminded me that seeking understanding never negates love, but rather can deepen it through honesty and gentle courage, words that resonated profoundly because emotional stories I had shared through my channel had often demonstrated that healing frequently begins at the point where fear meets truth. Encouraged by his reassurance, I sent a cautious message through the DNA platform to the unknown relative, unsure whether I even hoped for a reply, yet feeling that initiating contact at least acknowledged the silent presence now shaping my emotional landscape. And when days passed without response, I experienced simultaneous relief and disappointment, torn between appreciating the delay as emotional preparation time and longing for clarification that could guide my next steps forward. The uncertainty affected my creative process too, as recording stories became emotionally heavier, my voice sometimes wavering when narrating moments of identity discovery or family reconciliation, because my personal experience suddenly mirrored the deeply vulnerable themes I often conveyed to others, reminding me that storytellers are not separate from the emotions they narrate, but instead are often quietly living similar journeys off camera. Throughout this waiting period, I remained particularly gentle with myself, reducing social engagements and embracing quiet reflection walks through familiar neighborhood paths, noticing how ordinary settings felt subtly transformed under the lens of introspection, as though the physical world itself seemed to whisper that nothing remains static when one's inner narrative begins shifting toward growth. I wrote private journal entries for the first time in years, allowing unfiltered questions to flow freely onto pages without fear of judgment, recognizing that even if answers remained distant, acknowledging emotional truth mattered as much as uncovering factual truth, because clarity arises not solely from knowledge, but from emotional readiness to receive it. Eventually, a notification appeared on my phone one quiet morning, displaying a reply from the unknown name that had anchored my unease for weeks, and though the message itself was brief and careful, offering to communicate further while validating uncomplicated curiosity rather than alarm, the impact of this single line rippled deeply within me,
explicitly confirming that the unknown connection was not merely a system glitch or passing anomaly, but represented an authentic human link awaiting exploration. I reread the message many times before responding, feeling a powerful blend of nervousness and excitement, because reaching forward now meant stepping fully into the path of discovery without the refuge of uncertainty as emotional shelter. And as my fingers typed and retyped a tentative response, I silently promised to approach every unfolding truth with compassion, rather than judgment toward anyone whose past decisions might finally come into clearer view. That exchange ignited a quiet shift within my heart, dismantling the final illusion I had clung to, that knowledge might fade away if ignored, because instead truth patiently awaited the courage of recognition. And as I prepared myself emotionally for conversations that would follow with both this newly connected relative and eventually my beloved parents, I sensed that the calm stability I once relied upon was only momentarily disrupted, not destined for destruction, since true foundations strengthen not through untouched perfection, but through the gentle reconstruction that occurs when honesty, empathy, and love walk forward together.
The deeper I stepped into the unfolding truth after responding to that unknown relative, the more my internal calm quietly unspooled into a state of emotional tension I had never known before, not in dramatic outbursts or visible anxiety, but rather in a subtle, persistent heaviness that rested in my chest each morning, as if I were waking with a question instead of a breath, because knowing something life-altering might soon surface made everyday moments feel strangely fragile, as though any ordinary conversation or familiar laugh could suddenly become the last untouched memory before understanding everything changed. Communication through the genealogy platform slowly expanded into careful email exchanges with this person who had introduced themselves simply as Claire, a name that began to carry emotional weight long before I learned its deeper significance, and our messages remained gentle and respectful, full of tentative phrases and shared acknowledgments of uncertainty that reflected mutual sensitivity to unseen family complexities neither of us yet fully understood. She spoke briefly of her own curiosity sparked by test results, explaining that confusion had led her to search quietly for clarity rather than stirring emotional storms prematurely, and as I read her words I recognized in her voice a mirror of my own cautious hope, a shared emotional walk through territory none of us had ever intended to explore, but now found ourselves walking steadily forward through. The correspondence awakened a rising need within me to initiate real conversations offline, especially with my parents, because maintaining silence began to feel increasingly unnatural as understanding grew more concrete. Yet I hesitated repeatedly, trapped between dread of hurting them and longing for honesty that could stabilize the emotional unease building inside me. I replayed countless moments from my upbringing as if studying layered histories rather than superficial memories, and new interpretations surfaced regarding remarks made about unexpected turns or difficult choices from earlier family eras, phrases always delivered gently without context, yet now lingering with new potential significance that felt too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. Meanwhile, I participated in extended exchanges with Claire, gradually sharing personal details regarding childhood experiences, family traditions, and physical traits, noticing unsettling similarities emerge effortlessly, parallel preferences for quiet reflection, identical facial expressions captured in selfies we hesitantly exchanged, and oddly specific emotional tendencies that resonated too fluidly to ignore, causing each discovery to deepen both curiosity and unease simultaneously. At times, these similarities stirred excitement about belonging in unexpected ways, but more often they evoked sorrow, reminding me that connection uncovered late in life can never reclaim the shared years already lost to silence and secrecy, and I grieved quietly not just the potential fruit ahead, but time itself, lamenting the absence of childhood moments never shared between siblings who never knew they were siblings. The longer I postponed speaking with my parents, the heavier my emotional burden grew, because although fear restrained confrontation, my loyalty to emotional truth nudged me forward persistently, urging me to trust that compassion combined with honesty might support healing rather than damage relationships built on decades of genuine love. One evening after finishing recording a story centered on unexpected family reunions, I felt overwhelmed by its irony, since narrating fictionalized emotional clarity while privately withholding truth weighed heavily on my conscience, and I lingered alone afterward, microphone still warm, realizing that authenticity demanded personal courage as much as artistic dedication. Summoning quiet bravery, I scheduled a visit to my parents under neutral pretenses, assuring myself that in-person conversation rather than phone confrontation would allow space for tenderness and emotional nuance, recognizing the importance of facial expressions, pauses, and physical presence during any potential revelation. The days leading to that visit were marked with restless emotional anticipation as my thoughts rehearsed countless scenarios: gentle acceptance, shocked denial, subdued tears, or resigned explanations, yet no rehearsed outcome provided genuine comfort,
reminding me that truth unfolds unpredictably regardless of preparation. During my drive to their familiar home, autumn leaves drifted silently across the roadside, their brittle texture symbolizing the delicate emotional terrain I was approaching, and I became more aware of trembling beneath my steady breath, realizing physical reactions often betray internal unease even when calm composure is attempted. Once seated across from my parents at the kitchen table, sipping tea from mugs stained by years of daily ritual, my resolve wavered momentarily as maternal warmth wrapped me instinctively, almost persuading me to preserve peaceful ignorance rather than disrupt familial equilibrium established through quiet affection. Our conversation began casually, touching on weather updates and community news, until the growing urgency within my chest eventually pushed me beyond polite delays, and I gently explained that I had participated in a DNA test simply for curiosity, carefully avoiding accusatory language or emotional assumptions as I described unexpected matched relatives appearing on the results. Silence fell gradually as I spoke, thickening the air between us, and I noticed my mother's fingers ceasing their habitual rhythm on her teacup, while my father's gaze dropped fleetingly toward the table, subtle gestures communicating internal recognition before any words emerged. When I softly named Claire and described our correspondence, emotion surged through me like a tide finally freed, yet my voice remained steady despite an increasingly fragile calm, because I understood that how I presented truth might determine whether our family path leaned toward healing or emotional retreat. Tears welled quietly in my mother's eyes, not in dramatic overflow, but in gentle stillness, while my father's jaw tightened as if bracing against memories long restrained, confirming without direct admission that the situation was neither imagined nor misunderstood. After a prolonged pause, my mother spoke very quietly, acknowledging that they had always known a day might come when undisclosed chapters of their lives surfaced, and though she provided minimal details initially, her tone conveyed deep emotional preparation rather than surprise, validating my sense that loving silence had framed much of my family's foundation. My heart ached watching them as parental protectiveness shifted into vulnerability before my eyes, transforming lifelong pillars into fragile humans bearing decades-old emotional weight. And in that vulnerable moment, I felt less like a child confronting potential betrayal, and more like a fellow adult witnessing the complexity of choices made under pressures I was only beginning to grasp. They explained gently that circumstances preceding my birth involved painful decisions guided by fear rather than selfishness, rooted in desires to shield all involved from shame, emotional disruption, or unresolved hardship. Yet they avoided immediate specifics as if still gauging whether complete exposure might shatter something essential rather than mend it. Despite the emotional restraint in their explanations, I sensed an invisible breaking of emotional distance as my parents allowed partial truth into the open air of our shared present, and I recognized that the rising conflict I now faced was not of accusation or blame, but of navigating whether fuller honesty could coexist with the love that had always sustained us. That evening concluded without resolution, as emotional exhaustion overtook our fragile conversation, leaving questions suspended in compassionate uncertainty, and as I drove home through quiet streets illuminated by flickering lights, I felt humbled and unsettled, because though thirst acknowledgments had arrived, full clarity remained beyond reach, and I recognized that the real emotional crossing lay still ahead towards revelations that might strengthen my identity or unsettle it more deeply than any unanswered question ever had.
After that first gentle but unfinished conversation with my parents, the emotional tension settled into my daily life, like a quiet undercurrent beneath an otherwise steady surface, carrying with it a growing sense that the truth still held back now mattered as much as the initial revelation itself, because partial honesty can sometimes feel more unsettling than silence once curiosity has been awakened. I maintained careful communication with Claire, whose messages grew slightly more open as trust gradually formed between us, and through our shared vulnerability, we began comparing timelines, places of birth, and small family details, assembling fragments of a larger narrative neither of us yet fully understood, and each aligned piece added credibility to the possibility that our connection extended far deeper than mere genealogical coincidence. Emotionally, I felt caught between two parallel worlds, the family I had always known, tangible and emotionally rich, and the emerging family connection represented by Claire, invisible yet undeniably real, forcing me to reconcile how identity can expand without replacing existing love, though emotional logic rarely quiets the instinctive fear of emotional displacement. My parents, meanwhile, remained reserved, but increasingly introspective after our conversation, calling more frequently, yet seeming subtly distant in tone, as though unearthing old memories stirred emotions they had long learned to manage beneath daily routines, and I sensed they carried an unspoken desire to protect me even now, by offering dilution rather than clarity. This emotional tension followed me into my creative work, where storytelling sessions grew heavier as narrative themes mirrored my internal conflicts surrounding family truth and emotional endurance, and during recording breaks I found myself pausing longer than usual,
gathering composure while considering how strangely interconnected personal life and artistic expression had become. Amid these pressures, my husband's steady presence provided grounding support, reminding me repeatedly that emotional growth often resembles discomfort more than peace at its outset, and that relationships strengthen not by avoiding difficult conversations, but by navigating them gently together. Amid late evening journaling, I began drafting letters I never sent, one addressed to Claire expressing nervous anticipation of meeting one day and mourning lost time, another to my parents outlining fears I felt unable to speak aloud yet needed to process privately, recognizing that writing was the safest space to express emotional authenticity before voicing it face to face. Gradually, my cautious email exchanges with Claire progressed toward longer messages that included childhood stories and emotional reflections, rather than factual comparisons alone, and these intimate narratives forged a surprising bond marked by parallel emotional experiences, such as shared feelings of not fully belonging and early sensitivities both rooted in similar dispositional patterns, reinforcing that connection extends beyond genetics into shared emotional landscapes. We tentatively discussed the idea of eventually meeting, not with urgency but with mutual acknowledgement that such an encounter might answer deeply human questions, while simultaneously unveiling new emotional complexities we may not be prepared to carry yet. Meanwhile, my parents invited me for dinner once more, and I accepted knowing that unresolved truths must inevitably find voice, because avoidance could only prolong internal unrest without offering resolution. As we gathered again around the familiar kitchen table, I sensed a quiet emotional fortification in both of them, as though time had softened immediate vulnerability into ready willingness, preparing them to address fuller truths that initial shock prevented. My mother spoke first, her voice gentle but steadier than before, explaining that long before I was born, circumstances had pushed my biological father into a situation where remaining present was impossible, not due to absence of love, but due to fears surrounding instability and unresolved obligations that he believed might imperil any child raised amid ongoing turmoil, and that Claire was his daughter from a later relationship who had grown up unaware of his prior involvement with my mother. Hearing this information shifted emotional ground beneath me, because what once felt like potential deception now revealed itself as a story shaped more by fear and sacrifice than by betrayal, though emotional ache persisted for all involved. They confessed that official secrecy surrounding my conception had been deliberately maintained through mutual agreement to raise me, without exposing past complications they believed could burden childhood innocence or fracture extended family harmony, rationalizing the silence through protective love rather than denial of identity. As I listened, tears slid quietly as grief intersected with compassion, because understanding motivation softened resentment while not erasing the sadness of lost truth, and I realized emotional maturity resides in holding both recognition of loving intent and acknowledgement of personal sorrow simultaneously. Questions flooded gently yet persistently from me regarding why I have never been offered age-appropriate honesty as I grew older, and my parents expressed regret, acknowledging that protective intentions had eventually entwined with emotional avoidance until years passed and secrecy hardened into habit too daunting to dismantle. They admitted fearing rejection or emotional upheaval once I had built complete identity foundations around an accepted narrative, believing revelation would only bring confusion without benefit, unaware that identity uncertainty often breeds greater distress than truth itself, however complicated. In that moment, I voiced my emotional truth honestly, yet without accusation, expressing that while I adored and trusted them completely, the gradual discovery of concealed origins had shaken emotional safety I relied upon, and though forgiveness never felt out of reach, healing required time, conversation, and mutual vulnerability. My parents accepted my words quietly and without defensiveness, offering open acknowledgement of shortcomings alongside continued assurances of unconditional love, a response that diffused emotional tension far more than any justification could have achieved. After hours of shared reflection, small hugs replaced remaining stiffness at the table, offering physical reassurance where words had been insufficient. And as I prepared to leave, a sense of emotional transition lingered in the air, signaling that our family had stepped firmly into an unfamiliar chapter where old foundations were not lost, but must now be gently reinforced through ongoing honesty. Driving home that night, I contemplated whether to inform Claire of these new developments, recognizing that the story connecting all of us extended beyond individual emotional needs into a delicate network where every truth reshaped our relational balance. And I drafted a careful message that shared essential revelations while honoring my parents' vulnerability, resisting the urge to overshare details that could transform compassion into complication. When Claire replied with quiet empathy and gratitude for openness, expressing validation rather than judgment towards circumstances beyond anyone's control, I felt emotional tension settle slightly, comforted by mutual understanding that relatives discovered later in life must often approach connection with patience rather than expectation. Still, inner unrest lingered as I confronted the inevitable next step, meeting Claire in person, knowing that face-to-face connection would solidify emotional reality beyond digital safety and potentially deepen healing while opening emotional sensitivities not yet encountered. And as I lay awake that night, watching shadows ripple across my ceiling, I accepted that rising conflict is rarely about external confrontation, but more often about internal readiness to welcome truth's full emotional weight. Recognizing that while answers had begun to surface, the deepest emotional turning still waited ahead, where identity, forgiveness, and belonging would truly be tested once human presence replaced written words and imagined faces became undeniably real.
When the decision to finally meet Claire in person settled into certainty rather than possibility, the emotional weight of the journey ahead felt heavier than any conversation we had shared through screens or written words. Because transforming digital connection into physical presence would remove the last gentle distance between imagined understanding and lived reality, and I realized that whatever unfolded would mark the irreversible turning of a chapter, not just in our shared story, but within my own identity. We chose a small cafe halfway between our towns, neutral ground chosen deliberately for its quiet atmosphere and unobtrusive presence, allowing us emotional shelter should vulnerability surface unexpectedly. And on the morning of our meeting, I dressed simply, wanting comfort rather than performance, mindful that authenticity mattered more than appearances when confronting truths the heart must recognize beyond words. As I drove toward the meeting place, every memory of childhood car rides stirred faint echoes of innocence, heightening the awareness that I was approaching something profoundly different. An encounter that could reframe past assumptions without altering the love already embedded within me. Arriving early, I sat near the window where muted afternoon sunlight spilled gently across wooden tables, rehearsing calm breathing to slow rising tension while observing strangers pass by, each face no longer anonymous as I found myself wondering what unknown relatives other people might unknowingly walk beside daily. When Claire entered, recognition struck immediately despite our chosen caution, because resemblance transcended photographic hints. Stance, eye expression, and subtle gestures mirrored my own so closely that emotion erupted before words could form. And for an instant, I stood suspended witnessing a living confirmation of shared lineage that genetic percentages could never fully illustrate. Our greetings remained tentative at first, gentle smiles and awkward murmured hellos, yet deep emotional familiarity overflowed unevenly beneath polite introductions, and as we sat facing one another, the distance between two chairs felt symbolically vast until we began to speak, gradually dissolving tension through shared nervous laughter, acknowledging how surreal this entire meeting felt to both of us. Conversation began with simple subjects, our respective lives, work experiences, and hobbies offered as emotional warm-ups rather than factual disclosures. But emotional undercurrents grew with each exchange discovery of similarity, particularly when discussing creativity and sensitivity, realizing how parallel expressive instincts may have roots deeper than environment alone. As emotional comfort unfolded, Claire spoke candidly about her upbringing, describing a father she rarely saw consistently who carried emotional restlessness and offered vague explanations for absences without clarity. And though she recalled kindness rather than cruelty, absence had planted quiet confusion within her childhood heart that she no longer sought to blame but deeply wished to understand. Hearing her words layered complexity upon stories my parents had shared, as emotional threads woven across separate lives revealed historical gaps shaped by circumstance rather than malicious intent. Yet comprehension did not diminish the ache of recognizing how secrecy had influenced multiple individuals simultaneously, rippling through time unseen until now. I told Claire gently about my parents, their unwavering love and stability, and their confession regarding protective silence, emphasizing how survival instincts sometimes masquerade as simplicity decades later. And she listened with compassionate quiet rather than wounded resentment, acknowledging that while absence shaped her emotional development, hatred found no place within her understanding, because adulthood had taught her that people often make choices under pressure whose full consequences remain unseen until much later. As dialogue deepened, the cafe noise softened into background blur, and our emotional exchange expanded into honest expression of shared grief. Not grief rooted in death, but in lost opportunities, birthdays uncelebrated together, and parallel childhood longings never answered by mutual presence. Tears flowed freely between us, not as melodramatic spectacle, but as gentle release, signaling emotional recognition of sibling connection that transcended rational explanation and instead settled squarely into the heart. We discussed the prospect of integrating into one another's lives moving forward, acknowledging hesitations without letting fear dictate distance, exploring possibilities rather than demands, perhaps occasional conversations, shared holidays, or simply ongoing emotional support without pressure for immediate intimacy, understanding that forging connection after decades separated by circumstance must prioritize respect over momentum. During this conversation, I felt the turning point clarify within me, not simply as learning biological truth, but as discovering emotional capacity for expanded family rather than contracted loyalty. Because love, I realized, does not segment itself neatly when complexity arrives, but instead widens quietly, making room without displacing what already exists. At lunch's closing moments, Claire asked gently whether she might eventually meet my parents, emphasizing absence of blame or expectation, but rather emotional curiosity for the people whose silent decisions shaped the course of both our lives. And while uncertainty stirred briefly within me, I promised to consider this carefully, recognizing that timing would matter deeply for all involved. As we parted outside the cafe, an instinctive embrace replaced formal farewells, neither prolonged nor hesitant, but natural and affirming, grounding our connection in tangible affection beyond genetic confirmation. And as I drove home afterward, I felt remarkably lighter despite emotional intensity, because understanding had replaced anxiety, transforming fear of discovery into cautious anticipation for connections yet to come. Reflecting on the day, I recognized that emotional turning points rarely deliver neat conclusions or immediate serenity, but instead shift foundational perspectives. Mine now embracing an expanded identity inclusive of sisterhood discovered late rather than denied or feared, bringing newfound empathy towards choices made long before my awareness, yet simultaneously validating grief for truths withheld too long. That evening, I returned home with emotional clarity unlike anything experienced before, forcing honest reflection on forgiveness as both emotional release and deliberate practice rather than sudden decision.
acknowledging that forgiving my parents for silence would require time, not because of lacking love, but because depth of trust once absolute needed gradual reconstruction through ongoing communication and emotional transparency. In recording my thoughts privately, I noted that discovering siblings through DNA testing without prior awareness serves as a uniquely modern emotional crossroads where technology and humanity intersect, presenting proof without preparation and demanding emotional maturity to integrate biological facts with relational wisdom. Sending a message to my parents later that night, I shared that I had met Claire and found compassion rather than conflict there, reassuring them gently that my heart still anchored deeply to our family bond even as it extended tentatively outward, and their heartfelt reply expressed both relief and gratitude that understanding seemed to soften potential divides rather than deepen them. In bed that night, watching moonlight trace quiet patterns across familiar bedroom walls, I fully recognized the emotional turning unfolding within me, not a dramatic rupture but a steady emotional expansion, embracing truth without rejecting the love that shaped me, learning that identity grows not from eliminating layers but by adding stories to the foundation already laid, and recognizing with quiet awe that this turning point had not diminished family but broadened its definition, illuminating how compassion can bridge gaps that even decades of silence once held apart.
In the days following my meeting with Claire, the emotional transformation that had quietly begun continued to deepen, subtly yet powerfully reshaping how I thought about family, identity, and truth, because seeing her face in person had moved our connection beyond data points and heartfelt emails into undeniable shared humanity, and that recognition lingered in my thoughts as I processed what it meant to hold both gratitude for the parents who raised me and compassion for the biological ties newly discovered. I found myself revisiting old emotional assumptions, realizing how rigid definitions of family had once felt, built around singular loyalty and uncomplicated loyalty stories, and how meeting Claire had softened those assumptions into something more fluid and expansive, teaching me that family love does not operate like a limited resource, where welcoming one presence requires diminishing another, but instead grows quietly to accommodate complexity. My communication with my parents following the meeting became more open, their questions cautious yet sincere as they asked how I felt rather than how facts unfolded, revealing emotional vulnerability rarely shown during my upbringing when protective steadiness had defined their roles more than personal transparency. I shared with them that meeting Claire felt neither threatening nor destabilizing, but rather grounding, a strange yet comforting extension of personal history that allowed me to see our entire family narrative not as fragmented, but as layered and deeply hewn. There was a pause on the phone after I spoke, followed by my mother's trembling admission of long-held guilt over keeping silence, explaining how fear of hurting me had hardened into years of emotional restraint that gradually became heavier to carry than truth itself, a confession that moved me profoundly because I recognized emotional courage sometimes arrives later in life, not through dramatic gestures, but through tearful honesty we once felt unable to voice. My father echoed her sentiments with quieter vulnerability, admitting his own role in supporting secrecy out of loyalty and perceived necessity, expressing sorrow that protective intentions may have cost me the clarity I deserved earlier. And in hearing his words, I felt the softening of emotional remnants still lodged in me since discovering the DNA results, because accountability paired with compassion built bridges understanding alone could never form. Encouraged by this growing openness, we began discussing the possibility of introducing Claire to our family, not as disruptive revelation, but gentle expansion, contemplating what it might look like emotionally for everyone involved, including other relatives unaware of the hidden chapter in our histories, and acknowledging that transparency must progress thoughtfully rather than impulsively to ensure emotional safety across generational boundaries. My parents admitted they feared potential judgment from extended family, not because of shame, but concern for how complicated truths affect people deeply rooted in tradition. And although I sympathized with their apprehension, I gently expressed that secrecy's emotional toll eventually surpassed fears of public reaction, reinforcing that truth navigated with kindness fosters healing where silence inadvertently sustains separation. During private conversations with Claire, I shared my parents' growing honesty without divulging names or intimate vulnerabilities, mindful that trust had to be protected while compassion remained balanced across all relationships. And Claire received the updates with characteristic emotional maturity, reaffirming that her desire centered not on disruption or validation, but simple connection where mutual dignity guided interaction rather than unresolved grievance. As weeks passed, the acute emotional intensity began to settle into a steadier rhythm, shaping daily life more quietly than the initial upheaval, though inner reflection continued through journaling sessions where I mapped feelings of reconciliation beside lingering sorrow for what could never be regained, acknowledging that healing does not erase grief from missed years, but reframes grief as part of emotional expansion rather than evidence of injustice. I found renewed authenticity in my storytelling work as well, because narrating tales of emotional discovery now stemmed from lived understanding rather than empathetic imagination alone, enhancing sincerity in voice that listeners unknowingly perceived through subtle shifts in tone, and messages from viewers describing how stories resonated more deeply than before, affirmed my belief that personal vulnerability amplifies rather than weakens the emotional bonds created through shared narrative.
One afternoon, preparing tea before recording, I paused in reflection, realizing that the true emotional turning point lay not solely in discovering biological truth, but in learning how to integrate multiple emotional truths simultaneously. The truth of being profoundly loved and fully wanted by my parents, and the truth of having unseen emotional connections expanding beyond the family I thought exclusively mine. That realization eased inner conflict gradually, replacing fears of divided loyalty with appreciation for layered belonging, where identity no longer required simplification into singular narratives, but rather acceptance of complexity as a marker of emotional maturity. In time, my parents expressed readiness to meet Claire privately, without extended family present, hoping initial interactions remain intimate and supportive while everyone adjusted emotionally. And though nervous energy flickered at the prospect of this unprecedented encounter, I recognized its necessity in forging holistic healing rather than allowing invisible barriers to persist indefinitely. Plans formed gently for a quiet meeting at my parents' home, echoing the environment where love had always grounded me, and I felt a poignant emotional symmetry in inviting new familial bonds into the physical space of childhood stability that had protected me for decades. In preparation, I spoke with Claire honestly about potential emotional sensitivity surrounding the meeting, and she expressed respectful understanding, emphasizing gratitude simply for the opportunity to connect rather than harboring expectations of immediate emotional closeness or reassurance. As the scheduled date approached, I sensed emotional anticipation mingled with calm acceptance, replacing earlier dread, because whatever the outcome, courage had already rewritten narrative directions toward compassion rather than confusion. The day of the meeting unfolded with quiet gravity as I arrived at my parents' familiar doorstep with Claire beside me, our presence alone forming a symbolic convergence of divided narratives seeking reunion under one shared roof. And while introductions occurred with visible nerves and restrained emotion, genuine warmth emerged naturally as compassion triumphed over lingering apprehension. Conversation flowed haltingly yet earnestly at first, focusing on neutral topics before tentative acknowledgments of past circumstances emerged, and though tears surfaced sporadically among those present, there were no accusations or defensiveness, only shared vulnerability grounded in the simple desire to honor humanity across complicated histories. Watching my parents extend gentle hospitality toward Claire affirmed everything I hoped for, because the compassion that shaped my upbringing manifested again in new relational forms, signaling emotional healing in motion rather than theoretical aspiration. That evening ended not with dramatic breakthroughs nor complete emotional resolution, but with subtle shifts in mutual perception, glances lingering longer, quiet reassurances exchanged, and unspoken understandings forming bridges between formerly parallel lives now intertwined. Driving home afterward, Claire spoke softly of gratitude rather than relief, noting how emotional courage from all involved fostered dignity and kindness where fear might else have reigned. And listening to her reflections, I felt overwhelming gratitude for the transformative potential inherent within honest vulnerability. That night, journaling alone beneath lamplight, I articulated how the emotional turning point had matured fully, not defined by discovery, shock, or confrontation's outcome, but collective choice to allow compassion greater authority than pain, acceptance greater weight than resentment, and truth greater power than fear. Realizing that family, when guided by empathy, can hold layered stories without loss, expanding its heart quietly to welcome newfound connections without displacing the love that preceded them.
After the meeting between Claire and my parents, a slow but steady emotional settling began to replace the constant turbulence that had once dominated my thoughts, not because all feelings were instantly resolved, but because clarity finally carried enough emotional weight to quiet the uncertainty that had previously kept my heart suspended between fear and hope. And I noticed how everyday life gradually regained a sense of ease I feared I had lost during weeks of introspection. My parents' home returned to its familiar emotional warmth, though now layered with a deeper authenticity I had not known before, where conversations unfolded with greater transparency and unspoken truths no longer hovered invisibly between us. And while vulnerability sat quietly beside us during early visits after the introduction, it did not dominate the space as we learned to talk openly about the past with tenderness rather than restraint. Claire and I continued building our relationship slowly, choosing consistency over intensity as we exchanged regular messages and occasional phone calls shaped by mutual respect for emotional boundaries, understanding that siblings discovering one another late in life must cultivate connection like gardeners tending young growth rather than expecting mature bonds to bloom overnight. Our conversation shifted away from purely emotional processing toward ordinary familiarity as we shared stories about daily routines, childhood memories that surfaced under new context, and even trivial preferences like favorite foods or seasonal habits. And through these gentle exchanges, affection emerged quietly, neither forced nor dramatic, but rooted in natural recognition that we were learning to simply be present in each other's lives.
Meanwhile, honesty with my parents deepened into healing dialogues as we allowed ourselves to revisit long untouched chapters, not to reopen past wounds, but to understand emotional roots fully. And through these conversations, I recognized the magnitude of fear that had shaped their decisions decades earlier. Fears driven by social pressures, instability, and vulnerability that made protective silence seem preferable to risking emotional chaos in young family safety. Hearing these narratives from mature emotional perspectives softened lingering tension within me, because while the pain of omission remained real, compassion grew stronger in acknowledging how courage can falter under pressure, but reemerge later as humility and willingness to confront truth. I also acknowledged my own emotional journey toward forgiveness unfolding not as singular declaration, but as daily practice, finding release less in dramatic moments and more in repeated quiet acceptance of human imperfectness, reminding myself that authenticity emerges not from demanding perfection in others, but from allowing fallibility alongside love. In recording news stories for Granny Tales, I found deeper resonance in narratives centered on reconciliation and rediscovered family bonds, unconsciously weaving lived emotion into each spoken sentence. And viewer responses grew more heartfelt than ever, with messages from listeners sharing personal stories of lost relatives reunited, or secrets confronting long-held fears, reinforcing how communal storytelling becomes a mirror reflecting shared human journeys toward connection and healing. One particularly meaningful development occurred when my parents invited Claire to a family gathering, a small holiday dinner aimed more at symbolic inclusion than extended announcement. And though nervous excitement accompanied the preparation, emotional readiness had matured enough among us to approach this integration gently rather than anxiously. The evening unfolded quietly and beautifully as Claire entered our family circle with soft grace rather than hesitance, participating naturally in tableside conversations and assisting my mother in the kitchen just as any other relative might. And watching their interactions filled me with an unexpected swell of peace, because compassion had guided our blending rather than discomfort or forced redemption. Small moments, seemingly insignificant, marked emotional progress more vividly than any grand declarations. My father offering Claire tea without hesitation, my mother sharing childhood anecdotes without guarded pauses, relatives responding with kindness rooted in intuitive empathy rather than interrogative curiosity. And in those moments, I felt profound gratitude, witnessing how humanity's natural warmth can navigate even the most complicated truths with dignity. Not every emotion vanished entirely, of course, as quiet sadness still emerged occasionally during reminders of missed years impossible to recover. But grief no longer felt isolating or unresolved. Instead, it gently coexisted with appreciation for connections now present, teaching me that sorrow and gratitude are not opposites but companions, shaping emotional maturity. Meanwhile, Claire expressed growing contentment discovering how she fit within our family dynamic, noting how acceptance eased lifelong questions of origin and belonging that she had carried in silence, reminding me how discovery does not simply rewrite one person's story, but often liberates emotional burdens across multiple lives simultaneously. Engaging in consistent emotional honesty continued strengthening bonds with my parents, as transparency replaced the subtle distance previously cultivated through protective silence, enabling us to rebuild trust on foundations firmer than before, because they rested not on idealized stories but on truthful compassion. And watching my parents navigate vulnerability during this phase allowed me to see them fully as complex human beings who balanced love with fear just as any individual must. As emotional resolution progressed, I noticed how internal calm returned more naturally, marked by restful sleep no longer interrupted by persistent uncertainty, dreams free from recurring symbolism of divided families or unanswered questions, and waking mornings greeted with serene acceptance rather than unresolved emotional weight. Reflecting on the emotional arc traveled, from curiosity to disruption, revelation to reconciliation, I understood that closure rarely arrives as finality where all feelings rest neatly resolved, but instead unfolds as equilibrium where unresolved memories find peace within greater emotional truth rather than elimination, acknowledging that healing embraces complexity rather than erasing it. One afternoon, while walking beneath blooming trees whose soft petals littered the sidewalks like gentle reminders of renewal, I found spontaneous gratitude stirring for this emotional journey itself, recognizing how truth uncovered through DNA testing had bestowed not betrayal or abandonment, but expanded empathy toward family histories shaped by circumstance long predating my awareness, offering perspective that reframed identity as cumulative rather than exclusively inherited from any singular narrative. I began drafting this very story with the intention of sharing it honestly yet gently with listeners, believing that lived vulnerability carries healing potency not merely for self, but also for audiences navigating similar emotional crossroads. And as I wrote, I felt calm certainty guiding each word rather than previous hesitation, confident that compassion-infused truth would resonate more deeply than sanitized storytelling ever could. In conclusion of this period, I recognized the beginning of genuine emotional resolution unfolding not as a complete finishing of all stories, but as rhythmic continuity where reconciliation becomes evolving practice rather than episodic achievement. And that understanding allowed me to inhabit the present fully without anxiety about unanswered fragments, because love had proven resilient enough to hold truth without fracturing, guiding our family forward into a new chapter shaped by authenticity, acceptance, and quiet hope stronger than any fear that once bound us to silence.
As the weeks turned into months after Claire's integration into our family circle, emotional feeling deepened through steady presence rather than dramatic breakthroughs, and I found comfort in how normalcy gradually replaced novelty in our interactions, because ordinary moments, shared meals, occasional group calls, casual photos exchanged, became the quiet hallmarks of genuine belonging where emotional security grows most authentically. Conversations with Claire softened into natural rhythm, no longer focused solely on bridging years of absence, but shifting towards present joys and future hopes, discussing favorite books, weekend walks, and projects that filled our separate lives with purpose, rendering our connection less about biology alone and more about building emotional familiarity through shared experience. Meanwhile, relationships with my parents matured further into open emotional territory as stories long stored away surfaced slowly during relaxed evenings together, allowing them to finally express emotions once compressed beneath decades of practicality and restraint. And I welcomed their vulnerability gratefully, understanding that courage to revisit old decisions brings liberation not only to those seeking truth, but also to those who feared sharing it. These discussions revealed how silence, though originally intended as shield, had gradually become emotional burden affecting them deeply in later years, and witnessing their release through honesty strengthened my respect for human resilience shaped less by flawlessness than by willingness to evolve emotionally even after prolonged caution. In my own heart, forgiveness now rested naturally rather than as conscious effort, unfolding quietly until I recognized resentment had simply faded into gentle understanding, and what once felt like betrayal transformed into empathy for difficult choices made under emotional vulnerability before I ever existed. The residual sadness over lost time endured but no longer stung sharply. Instead, it hovered softly beside gratitude for present connection, because grief does not demand elimination to heal, it seeks acceptance as part of emotional truth. Within this equilibrium, creative work flourished as storytelling resumed with renewed emotional depth where vulnerability infused narrative authenticity, and listeners sensed underlying sincerity even without knowing details of my lived journey, responding with heartfelt messages describing parallels to their own stories of adoption discovery, half-sibling reunions, and long-hidden familial truths emerging into open light. Encouraged by these shared testimonies, I became increasingly convinced that personal truth spoken compassionately can catalyze healing beyond oneself, forging invisible threads of understanding among strangers navigating similar emotional awakenings. My parents grew comfortable acknowledging Claire as family openly, not with hesitance or defensiveness, but with warmth that mirrored the love they had always shown me, reinforcing the realization that expanded family does not dilute original bonds, but amplifies the circle of care held between hearts willing to embrace complexity. Claire expressed deep gratitude for acceptance she never anticipated, sharing how emotional peace filled long-standing questions she had quietly carried about identity and belonging, and hearing her reflections affirm for me how connection heals ambiguities that even factual answers cannot resolve alone. Over time, extended relatives learned of her story not through sudden announcements, but through gentle, natural progression of family gatherings where Claire appeared naturally alongside us, her presence explained simply rather than sensationalized, and invitations extended without fanfare upheld dignity while allowing relationships to evolve organically, demonstrating how emotional safety thrives under normalization rather than spectacle. Watching wider family members respond with compassion reinforced faith in humanity's intrinsic empathy when truths are introduced with care rather than fear, because curiosity softened into acceptance more easily than anticipated, dispelling earlier anxieties that complicated histories inevitably divide communities. I reflected often on how the DNA test had catalyzed transformation without destruction, awakening a reality where technological discovery intersected profoundly with relational wisdom, reminding me that progress alone does not dictate healing. Conscious emotional navigation guides discoveries toward growth instead of fracture. Even daily routines regain sublime beauty after prolonged emotional strain, from quiet morning coffees to leisurely evening walks where gratitude breathed through ordinary scenes now cherished more deeply because peace restored carries unique serenity valued only after disruption subsides. During solitary reflections, I occasionally revisited the initial excitement and fear that accompanied the first glance at test results, marveling at how something so impersonal as digital data became conduit for profound emotional evolution, not merely revealing ancestry, but catalyzing collective courage toward honesty among all involved. Over dinner one evening, my father leaned back thoughtfully and voted how secrets, when born from love yet maintained through fear, inevitably yearn for light in later years. And his simple remark resonated deeply within me as quiet affirmation that truth seeks liberation regardless of its age, quietly waiting until emotional readiness aligns across all hearts affected. My mother added softly that silence's release had lightened her spirit immeasurably, acknowledging long-standing tension she had grown accustomed to carrying privately. And observing her renewed emotional ease brought joy greater than any sense of vindication could provide. Their shared reflections reminded me that truth serves not as instrument of confrontation but of collective healing when wielded gently. In speaking privately with Claire, she shared that discovering family connection later in life taught her patience and intentional relational building rather than longing solely for lost time, believing that meaningful relationships measure themselves not by duration but depth of sincerity and mutual respect. And hearing this philosophy mirrored my own evolving understanding of connection. Gradually, my inner identity settled into expanded harmony, recognizing myself not as fractured between past and present, but enriched by multifaceted belonging that allowed gratitude toward parents, sisterhood with Claire, and authenticity within my storytelling simultaneously without contradiction. I felt anchored in the knowledge that emotional maturity allows individuals to hold multiple truths without diminishing one another. Love for adoptive or social parents does not weaken biological curiosity. Sibling bonds formed late do not erase childhood familial security, and embracing honesty never invalidates gratitude for emotional upbringing. As seasons shifted quietly outside my windows, marking time's gentle progression beyond our personal stories, I felt profound appreciation for how resolution emerged not through grand climactic closure, but through sustained, compassionate integration woven into everyday life, discovering beauty in quiet continuity rather than dramatic endings. Writing the final lines of this story for my audience, I recognized how personal narrative ultimately carries universal resonance when rooted in emotional honesty, because countless individuals quietly carry undiscovered connections, hidden origins, or incomplete family narratives, craving gentle exploration rather than fearful suppression. My experience revealed that DNA revelations do not inherently devastate lives. They instead present emotional challenges whose outcomes depend entirely upon the compassion extended by those willing to embrace truth together rather than apart. This realization marked true emotional resolution, not elimination of all pain, but acceptance that truth, once integrated into loving context, becomes source of peace rather than division, illuminating how understanding grows within vulnerability and how expanded family is not defined by shared blood alone, but by shared courage to love deeply across complexity.
As the months passed and Marcia adjusted to this new reality, a gentle calm settled over our lives that felt almost sacred because the turbulence of discovery had given way to understanding, acceptance, and quiet joy. And I realized that life often offers moments of emotional revelation, not to punish us, but to expand our hearts in ways we never anticipated. Claire became a regular presence in family gatherings, her laughter blending naturally with ours, and the awkwardness that once hovered at introductions transformed into shared smiles, subtle glances, and the kind of unspoken understanding that can only emerge from mutual compassion and patience. My parents, once hesitant to revisit past decisions, spoke more freely about choices made with protective intentions, and in hearing their reflections, I gained not only knowledge but deep empathy for the people who had always loved me unconditionally, even when silence obscured truths they thought necessary to guard. Our conversations now carried softness and depth, each word measured but genuine, and small gestures, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet laugh at a shared memory, a moment of listening without interruption, built a rhythm of relational trust and emotional presence that made the house feel more alive than it ever had before. I found myself reflecting often on the twists of fate that led to our meeting. A simple curiosity about a DNA test, a cautious message from a stranger who would become family, and the courage to confront truths that had lingered for decades. And each step reminded me that love is both resilient and expansive, capable of holding past mistakes, hidden histories, and newfound connections all at once. Writing these reflections from my storytelling channel, Granny Tales, I realized how profoundly personal stories of reconciliation resonate with others, because audiences not only witness our journey, but find echoes of their own hidden fears, unresolved questions, and unspoken longings within it. And that shared emotional space becomes a kind of communal healing. The quiet evenings spent with Claire and my parents now carry a rhythm of warmth, where stories are told, memories revisited, and laughter mingles freely with the occasional tears that no longer hurt, but remind us of growth, resilience, and the enduring power of love. Looking back, I understood that the DNA test had never been about percentages, family trees, or labels. It had been a catalyst for empathy, courage, and emotional depth, challenging us to confront our fears and embrace one another fully with patience and gentleness.
The most profound lessons lay not in discovery alone, but in how we chose to respond, how compassion guided our interactions, and how love expanded to include someone we had never known existed, yet had always belonged in heart. As I sat quietly at my desk one evening, recording a voiceover for a new story, I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the journey from uncertainty to connection had been difficult yet transformative, that it had reshaped my understanding of family, forgiveness, and identity, and that this emotional evolution was a gift I would carry forward for the rest of my life. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated a page of handwritten reflections, each line an acknowledgement of fear, curiosity, patience, and finally joy. And I realized that the narrative we had lived would now continue to shape not only our family, but countless others who might hear our story and find courage to seek truth and connection in their own lives. That night, as I closed my notebook and looked toward the quiet streets outside my window, I understood fully that endings in life are rarely final. They are invitations to continue with love, understanding, and openness, carrying lessons learned and connections made into every new day. And so, with gratitude and quiet hope, I embrace this chapter not as a conclusion, but as a living testament to the power of truth met with compassion, the resilience of family, and the enduring strength of the human heart to grow, forgive, and love beyond expectation. In the days and months that followed, the warmth of our expanded family settled into quiet rhythms that felt both familiar and entirely new, as if life had stretched to make room for the unexpected yet precious presence of Claire, without taking away from the bonds that had always existed. And in that space, I discovered the subtle power of love's elasticity. Our conversations, once tentative and carefully measured, now flowed naturally, punctuated with laughter, shared stories, and occasional moments of reflection that no longer carried tension, but a gentle reverence for honesty and understanding. I noticed how the small gestures, preparing tea together, exchanging books, sharing favorite recipes, took on emotional weight far beyond their simplicity, marking the presence of trust, comfort, and familial belonging. And these moments reminded me that the essence of family lies not in perfection or planning, but in shared experiences, mutual respect, and the willingness to embrace complexity. As I guided my storytelling on Granny Tales, I realized that our narrative of discovery, reconciliation, and gradual emotional integration resonated deeply with viewers, many of whom reached out to share similar journeys of long-lost relatives, DNA revelations, or hidden family truth. And in their responses, I found a renewed sense of purpose and connection, recognizing the ripple effect that honesty and compassion can create beyond immediate circles. Quiet evenings became reflective spaces where I could contemplate the journey from uncertainty to acceptance, from fear to understanding, and I recognized how much growth had occurred, not only within me, but across all relationships touched by the revelation of truth. Claire and I shared a bond that was neither rushed nor superficial. It developed organically, nurtured by patience, shared curiosity, and a mutual desire to honor the past while embracing the present. And through her presence, I understood that family is a living, evolving entity, strengthened not by blood alone, but by the courage to connect, forgive, and nurture trust. My parents' openness grew in tandem with my own as they embraced Claire with genuine warmth, allowing the delicate threads of new family ties to weave seamlessly with the history we had long known. And watching them do so affirmed for me the profound resilience and adaptability of love when guided by honesty rather than fear. Reflecting on this entire experience, I realized that the DNA test, initially a source of anxiety and apprehension, had served as a catalyst for emotional awakening, prompting each of us to confront vulnerability, revisit old stories with compassion, and ultimately expand the boundaries of what family could mean. I came to understand that the turning points in life often arrive quietly through small decisions, courageous conversations, and moments of openness that ripple outward, reshaping relationships, self-perception, and the emotional landscapes of everyone involved. Writing and narrating our story for my audience became an act of continued healing, transforming private reflection into shared empathy, and in witnessing the reactions of viewers who resonated with our journey, I understood the universal truth that vulnerability invites connection, and that even stories rooted in personal complexity can offer comfort, guidance, and hope to others navigating their own intricate paths. Sitting quietly one evening, observing the soft light filtering through familiar windows, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the parents who raised me with unwavering love, for Claire, whose arrival expanded the definition of family, and for the courage we all displayed in facing truth together. This gratitude was accompanied by the quiet realization that life's most meaningful lessons often emerge from unexpected revelations, and that emotional growth is less about the absence of difficulty than about embracing challenges with integrity, empathy, and patience. As I prepared to close this chapter of storytelling, I reflected on the lasting impact of compassion, patience, and openness, the invisible threads that had guided us from discovery to reconciliation, from uncertainty to belonging, and I understood fully that the story does not end here, because love, truth, and understanding continue to evolve, quietly shaping our lives in ways both subtle and profound. And so, I rest in the calm of this new chapter, carrying forward the lessons of resilience, forgiveness, and expansive love, knowing that family, in its truest sense, is defined not solely by shared genetics or past histories, but by the courage to embrace one another fully, honor the journey of each individual, and nurture connections that endure across time, circumstance, and the unexpected turns that life inevitably presents.